I worked at Walgreens when I was 19 for a little income while going to college. I worked overnight as a shift supervisor. This occurred sometime in late autumn. Nights were quiet and slow, mostly just stacking shelves and putting up tags. One night as I walked in from my shift, there was a woman leaning against the counter, chatting with the cashier. "Who is he? Why does he have a hood on?" she asked the cashier, pointing at me, very obviously wired. I paid no mind and went to the back to begin opening procedures. I gave her a curious glance. She had a flowery, old-fashioned velvet Edwardian hat on, right out the 1920s. Strange. She acted paranoid, but I was still tired, so I just ignored her. I was passed before I walked back onto the floor around 1 a.m. Out of my peripherals, I noticed a woman seated at the pharmacy with a huge rimmed hat, faded Auburn coat, and large, thick glasses. I looked off and saw that it was that woman, and the pharmacy was long closed. I noticed that she was holding several bags, and passively assumed she was waiting for a ride. But she'd been here for 3 hours. Odd. The cashier told me that the woman was making her extremely uncomfortable, and that she'd been asking if I was an undercover police officer. I assumed she was harmless, lonely old lady, so I decided to approach and engage her in casual conversation in order to feel her out and hopefully calm her down. "Hi, is there anything I can help you with?" The conversation began pleasantly enough. We exchanged niceties, and she told me about her life. She mentioned she was married to an oil tycoon years back, and described how she owned several lavish homes up and down the New England coast, how she used to travel to Paris, France, and Greece on a yearly basis, all the while fiddling with something inside of her massive purse. She talked about her son and other family, which I now don't recall. Despite my nodding, I tried difficultly to conceal my skepticism, especially after mentioning that her first husband was a famous vaudevillain in New York. She'd have to be about 110 years old for this to be true. Her over-the-top stories forced me to start examining her clothes. Her boots looked cheap and were coming unstitched. Her hair was wild and matted, dyed a bright red, fading upwards to grey. Face weathered and full of lines and cracks, like a calving glacier. She looked like she's been through hell. Nothing spelled socialite to me. In fact, it was the opposite. I got called up front and momentarily excused myself. I teamed back and continued with menial chatter. I listened to her blabber on while I called her a cab. But things began to go down a different path. "My neighbors are trying to kill me." "Holy shit. Oh, that's no good. They killed all of my cats. They've been spraying bug spray into my basement for 14 years. Down. The CIA spies on me from Britain. They use a giant TV. My fucking neighbors put their garbage cans outside to block the transmission signals. They know what I'm thinking. And wow. I know they're closing in." She began to whisper and signaled for me to move closer. "Are those girls up front in the FBI? It's okay. You can tell me." I was in a mental tailspin before getting called up front once more. I wasn't prepared for what happened next. I took care of whatever needed doing at the registers and returned. I walked back down to the pharmacy area and found that the woman had disappeared. I returned to the front and asked when she'd left. "What? Left? She never left," the cashier explained. She must be walking around," I told her. "Please find her. She creeps me out," the cashier said. I walked up and down every aisle. I couldn't find her. I returned to the cashier and asked if the woman left, and I missed her. "No, nobody's left." "The hell?" "She must have went into the back to the bathroom, a bathroom that's only really for employees." "No, I looked everywhere. She wasn't in the bathrooms, and the office door was locked. So were all the other doors in the store." I was confused. There was only one other place she could be. The door was open to the back storage room, and from there were the stairs leading to the basements. The cab company wasn't coming through, so all that was left were the police. But I had to find her first. As I passed through the back hallway, I noticed that her 2 full bags, along with a purse, were spread out across stacked boxes of cereal. I noticed that her purse was opened up widely. Whatever she was tinkering with earlier, she must have taken out. Jesus. She, however, was nowhere to be found. She didn't just evaporate through the walls, and the basement was all that was left. I opened the door to go downstairs. A move I was most certainly not very enthusiastic about. At first, I was downright creeped out. The basement, ugh. "Hello?" I shouted. Nothing. This was getting tense and, frankly, a little scary. I remained upstairs as I called the police. They'd be sending a cruiser immediately, so I called the front of the store and told it to call me over the PA system when they got here, with the code words for a cash pickup at the register when it would exceed a certain limit. And from there, I proceeded down the stairs. The basement was dimly lit and large, used to store the majority of our backstock. It also was the location of receiving for when we'd get in trucks. Once you descend the staircase, the room opens up to the right. On the right-hand side, running from the back up to the front receiving door, was an automated belt used to move product as it would come in. To the left were large shelves, usually fully stocked with anything from 12 packs of soda to detergent and canned food. I turned the corner and looked directly down the room, and I saw nobody. "Hello?" I called out once more. A shuffling off to the left, on the other side of the shelf unit, and of course, an area of almost total darkness. When you first enter the basement, you can only see the side of the shelves facing you. They were massive and usually so stocked that you couldn't see the other side, the side where she most likely was. I broke into a cold sweat. A clinking noise, followed by a shuffling once more. I tiptoed to the dark lane of shelves and peeked my head around the corner very carefully. Just a few inches. She didn't notice me, but I noticed her. Crouching down in the shadows, holding something long and slim in her hand, about 10 feet away, in the dark. I was absolutely frozen in terror. I couldn't move, my gaze fixated on the woman. I could see she no longer was wearing her hat. Her wild hair jutting out on all sides like some demented clown, the only sliver of light illuminating only the tips of her blood-red curls. And then came from her mouth in a whisper, "Shh, now, he's with the police." And then she gasped and began slowly inching her way towards me, shuffling across the dirty concrete floor on her hands and knees. She was fucking crawling. I pulled back and tried to quietly tiptoe back to the stairs. Those few seconds of walking backwards, just watching the corner of the storage shelves, waiting for it to appear, felt like eons. I'd noticed that whatever was in her hand could have been anything from a long screwdriver to a knife. I snuck behind the corner and ran up the stairs. Before I reached the top, I looked behind me to the bottom. Skin, 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 skin. I could hear her knees scraping against the floor as she drew closer, her incoherent mumbling to an invisible person, drawing nearer to the foot of the stairs. Suddenly, over the speakers, Code 4 and Register 1. I pushed open the door and ran up to the front to be greeted by 2 officers. I explained the situation, made only more tense by the alarmed reaction of the first officer, prompting him to call for backup. "You say she's downstairs?" "Yeah, back there," I pointed. The officers marched ahead of me as I guided them to the back. Then, as we made it through the entrance, the second officer shot me a concerned look and told me to stay there. "Hello?" the officer audibly yelled out. "Ma'am, are you down there?" I heard the doors to the basement creaking opened, and then the shut behind the officers. Muffled yells in the form of questions. And then, by God, I'll never become a cop after what happened next. The men began to scream, "Put it down! Ma'am, I need you to stay there where you are and put it down." A shrill, violent shrieking scream followed, before the officers began yelling out muffled commands. Fuck it, I had to see. I made my way around the corner and to the top of the steps and peered down. Right there, at the bottom of the stairs, both officers had her on the ground, one with her knee in her back as she thrashed and wailed. She turned from a gentle old lady to a possessed lunatic like a switch was turned in her brain. "Ah, fuck," one officer cried out, wiping at the side of his face. Two more officers walked into the back and I motioned for them to go downstairs. As the woman screamed, "I knew it! I knew you were all coming after me!" The officer was wiping blood from his face. She slashed him with a box cutter. He was bleeding so profusely, I had to bring him towels into the bathroom. Eventually an ambulance came. It took 2 officers and a taser to take this woman down, who I later found out was a local paranoid schizophrenic who had no children and was living in some sort of halfway house. None of which I've mentioned so far was the most frightening part. Once they brought her up to the front in handcuffs, she shot me the most terrifyingly evil look anyone has ever given me and said, "I would have killed you." That last sentence has given me nightmares ever since. They've continued to persist week after week, year after year. I've never seen or heard about that woman again. But still, in my nightmares, wherever I might be the dream, I always have a gut feeling that this woman is lurking. Sometimes behind me, sometimes just on the other side of the window, looking into my living room with a retractable razor in her hand, waiting to slice my eyes open. I simply can't shake the idea that had I made even the slightest noise when I was in that basement, she would have jumped to her feet and I'd have been on the receiving end of a switchblade, spitting up blood from a slashed jugular. And it absolutely could have been so. I had just gotten married in September of 2012. Just prior to this, my wife and I had moved into our first house. It was a quiet, peaceful neighborhood, full of smiling faces and bright dispositions. However, in this house, from the very first day, something was just effed. Eventually, my wife would acknowledge this, but I knew it from the very first night. It was a 2-story home built sometime in the 1940s. It had a rustic, antique appeal. The floors were wooden, it creaked and cracked, pipes expanding and constricting. It smelled of some old schoolhouse in colonial Gettysburg, which people would take guided tours of. I once visited Abraham Lincoln's bedroom in Washington, D.C. when I was 12 years old, the one he died in, with his blood-stained bedsheets. The smell transported me back to this hidden memory immediately. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms, one in each end of the hallway, with a bathroom in the middle. The room to the right of the top of the stairs became the bedroom. To the left, a storage and makeup room for my wife. The house was full of exposed pipes and drains. This seemingly unfashionable attribute only added to its aging charm. The first night, my wife went to bed, while I stayed up watching the horror film Lovely Molly. I'm sure this only magnified the feeling of general unease I was experiencing, or at least made me more aware of it. That first night, I heard a bang on the door leading to the basement, which was in the corner of the kitchen. That basement was not a place to be alone. Just standing atop the stairs looking down into that black, murky abyss shook us both and infused us with overwhelming dread. She would never go down there, alone, not even in the first week, before all of it started. Something was wrong with that basement. I initially dismissed the sound as the cliché of a house settling. The creaking became more apparent a few weeks in. By now, it was October. It was strange. The lights in the house, when turned on, emitted a dimmer luminescence than previously. At first I attached it to that somber feeling of mid-autumn, where sunlight dwindles and dims, and darkness falls earlier and earlier. One night I was sitting downstairs watching TV, very late, past midnight. My wife was already in bed. My attention was meandering between the TV and my phone, when I heard a noise. The sound of pacing back and forth, in the room above the couch I was sitting on. My wife's makeup room. The thumps were light and brisk, definitely a more feminine step, or possibly the steps of a child. I wondered my wife was pacing back and forth in the other room after she'd gone to bed. It didn't make sense for her to be rummaging around through those boxes in the middle of the night. Those steps were incessant, relentless, really. Some. What is she doing, a fool? I went upstairs. When I opened the bedroom door, I saw her wrapped in the covers, snoring. I told her about this nocturnal activity in the makeup room. She rolled her eyes and said I was imagining things, and to lay off the horror movies. Perhaps she was right, or so I thought. Until she heard it herself. I was just finishing my shift at work. It was about 9:45. I closed at 10 p.m. I was about to close the store when my phone began vibrating in my pocket. It was my wife. She sounded frantic, but at the same time subdued, like she was deliberately trying to be quiet. More appropriately, she sounded concerned. In a panicked tone, she hurriedly said to me, "There's someone upstairs. I can hear them walking around. I'm so scared. Please, get home quick." I hurried out early, not knowing if I even locked the door on the way out. I was home in under 10 minutes. When I walked in the house, she was standing in the middle of the kitchen with clenched fists positioned under her chin, with all of the lights on. Her eyes were wide. She was petrified. Before I could speak, she interjected with, "Shh, listen," in a whispery tone. We stood silent and still, and then I heard it, a pit-patting of footsteps, pacing nervously around the room, going in circles, walking the perimeter of the room, instead of back and forth, over and over. My gun was upstairs in the bedroom. I know I frightened her when I pulled out the biggest kitchen knife I could find and started up the stairs. She had a phone opened, ready to dial 911. I looked up the imposing staircase into the darkness with dread mounting and intensifying from one second to the next. I didn't fool around. I quickly made my way up the steps, listening closely. Then, right before I hit the top, the thumps halted. This unnerved me to no end. I could almost hear the silence. All inanimate objects in the house lost whatever glimmer of life they had, almost as if the walls themselves were listening with me, like my house was alive and afraid for both of us. I pressed forward around the corner and flicked on the light. As quickly as I turned that light on, in a split second the bulb flashed and then burned out. A simmering noise echoing from the electrical failure. I was standing in the doorway of a pitch-black room. I shined my phone flashlight around the room and searched every corner. Nothing. Nobody. As she believed me now. A week later, we had a group of friends over for her friend Natabi's birthday. We watched Insidious and then sat around in the dark, telling ghost stories. This is when my wife brought up our little haunting. We spoke about it with levity. That is, until a standing framed picture of us was slapped over face down onto our glass-end table. A table which none of us were near. Everyone jumped and collectively screamed, then stopped. Silent. This only happened after a good hour. When I finally started talking about our ghosts, the air was tense and thick enough to be physically cut. And then, a gaggle of nervous, drunken laughter. There was no embellishment in describing the picture as being slapped down. Angrily. not but a few days later. My wife told me something which seamlessly illustrates the overall aura and feeling of living in this house. She said, "When I'm not here, I feel happy. When I walk in this house, I feel instantly depressed." I agreed. They see evil feeds off of negativity. Throughout October and November, my wife and I began to argue a lot more. Much of the time about benign things like leaving a dirty dish in the sink or maybe simple disagreements about our plans for Thanksgiving. But the arguments about such mundane things had become punctuated by momentary mutual hatred, which we could not explain. When we would leave the house together in the car, we would make up and ponder why such meaningless quibbles could fill either of us with such anger and cruel contempt for one another. We agreed wholeheartedly that it was the house. Something didn't want us there. By November, things took a drastic turn for the worse. One night, as I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, my heart began to race. It felt like I was pounding out of my chest. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The left side of my face went numb. I felt a shooting pain on my left arm, classic symptoms of an oncoming stroke or heart attack. I was only 28. What the hell? I jumped out of bed, sped to the store, and picked up some baby aspirin, fearing the worst. Over the next 2 months, I would have went to the emergency room 11 times, to 5 different cardiologists. Several of those times, my resting heart rate was above 130 BPM, more than twice what it should have been. I was informed nothing was wrong with me time and time again, and that they were simply panic attacks, which often mimic strokes. This only ever happened while in the house. By about the 5th time I ran out to go to the ER, my wife was a broken mess, tears. A horror movie junkie. One night I was watching The Exorcist 3. In the film, there's a terrifying scene where a serial killer screams the words, "He watches while I rip and cut and mutilate the innocent," over and again and on and on. I paused it right after this on-screen exchange between a murderer and detective, and went downstairs into the basement to get laundry. That feeling that something was watching me from the shadowy corners of the room was always occurring down there, and I intentionally ignored it. I felt its anger this night. The feeling was beyond palpable. I could feel the eyes burning a hole in my back, radiating through my bones, and getting chills as I typed these words. At the moment, I'm extremely uncomfortable, but I digress. The feeling of hate was stabbing me like searing needles all over. I was never this bad. It was the first and only time which I smelled something. The smell of rotten eggs. It wafted through the air, momentarily pungent, followed by absence. Jesus. However, something else happened this night. Something which from that point on forced me to abandon any notion of entering this basement at night ever again. I stopped at one point, as I could hear a faint voice coming from a side room, a strange walled-off space in the basement which had no apparent purpose, which we used for storage. I heard the voice emanating from a corner of the room, and what I heard was exactly this. I rip and cut and mutilate the innocent over and again. I paused dead in my tracks as sweat formed over my brow. My hands were white. I may have been shaken. Sounded like an old, turned-down television, not more than 5 feet from me. Those words. Those exact words and that exact voice from the movie. And yet, there was no TV down there. This couldn't be. I gathered a bundle of clothes, turned and ran for it, with my head down, praying I wouldn't see whatever was in the corner causing my smell. I dropped socks and underwear on the way up, but left them behind. I made it to the top of the stairs and slammed the door shut. I didn't even reach to turn off the lights. I ran to the TV, assuming it had turned back on its own. But no. The movie was paused in the exact same place which I left it, Those awful words were spoken to me in that basement straight out of a horror movie, like some loathing entity was using some copy of that scene to heed a warning to me. By now, a ghost would have been a delight. This was beyond a haunting. We were being terrorized. I couldn't believe it. I saw us going mad. I've never used drugs, and I don't drink, ever. This insane could not be blamed on my subconscious or my sanity. I was of perfectly sound mind. So was my wife. When I told the story to my wife the next day, she stopped me before I could finish. She couldn't listen to the rest of it. I was perplexed. She mentioned that smell. She told me earlier that day, a plate which we had on our wall had been thrown to the floor when she was in the kitchen. She said it smelled like farts. She said she blamed our new puppy, Henry, for it. I'd never seen a look of such abject horror in her eyes. It got to a level of such intense fear for her that she refused to be in the house alone after sundown. She began spending copious months of time at her mom's. I understood. By now, winter had come. 2013 was a bad one where we lived. Uncommonly fierce, which forced us into that place for days at a time. The foreboding angst of that damp concrete basement continued to grumble beneath our feet. Now, if I had to go down there, it was during the day, as long as the door was left opened and my wife was in the kitchen talking down to me. The pikes were banging more loudly. There was an inexplicable knocking on the walls that began to catch us off guard. And these footsteps. One night, while our wife was sound asleep, I was doing my usual late-night TV watching with our new puppy. He was a black teacup Pomeranian named Henry. It was past midnight. Like clockwork, the walking around upstairs began again. It persisted. I muted the TV and listened. What frayed my nerves even more was the sight of my puppy's raised ears, and seeing all of his hair stand up as his body froze in a state of alertness. We could both hear her. The footsteps were loud now, thudding, stomping. I thought my wife would wake up. She sat mutually petrified for several minutes. Henry began to groan. How things dogs do right before they're about to start barking. And then those horrible, brisk footsteps made their way out of the room and into the hallway. It didn't creak, crack, or grumble. It wasn't sluggish. It was moving quickly and angrily. And then, as clear as day, it happened. Henry stood to his feet and pointed his nose towards the stairs. He moved ahead of me on the couch in a protective posture. Footsteps began walking down the stairs. I grabbed Henry before whoever could greet me at the bottom of the stairs and bolted past the steps, again, trying not to lock up, and barreled through the dining room and kitchen, and swung open the back door and pushed my way outside into the snow and freezing wind. I stood there in the most utterly horrific moments of my entire life, gripping my puppy tight, staring into the house. Standing in socks in the wet snow, I thought I saw a shadow pass through the kitchen towards the basement door and disappear. Minutes passed before even considering going back in there, but then I thought of my wife. I got angry and confident. I went back into the kitchen, opened the basement door, and yelled down, "Fuck you!" I didn't know what else to do. And that was not a very smart idea. It was a momentous occasion where my senses shot through the roof, and I felt I was ready to jump out of my own skin and run away for good. This thing was here with us, becoming ever more enraged. Throughout the rest of the year, we witnessed that plate fly off the wall 2 more times before taking it down for good. On other nights, a hanging plant over our dining room table began swinging violently with no source of wind, an event which her mother actually witnessed herself when they were cooking dinner together. Voices, knocking on the walls. One incident where the blatant knocking startled my wife to the point where she nearly spilled a pan of hot grease on herself. And a terrifying experience where I was literally sitting on the toilet and heard 3 distinct, loud, and very obvious knocks on the bathroom door. They were so apparent I yelled to my wife, "I'll be out in a minute." When I went into the hallway, she wasn't there. I went into the room and found her sound asleep. The knocks, they always came in 3s. I've heard that there is a demonic manifestation insulting the Holy Trinity. I was still it was bullshit. Not anymore. We toughed it out all the way to the end. We did everything we could to be positive. We watched funny movies, we laughed, we spent as much time away from there as possible. And yes, we took Hemi with us. We couldn't leave him alone in there with that thing. We did everything together, and didn't linger around alone. I started laying with her and Henry while she'd fall asleep. As spring rolled around, the activity coupled with our change in attitude and working together seemed to curtail the activity. As soon as our lease renewal came, we moved out. Gone from our lives was the darkness, anger, negativity, and being terrorized by an insidious, unseen inhabitant. This wasn't the end of it all. Sometime the next summer, I took a drive down our old street around dusk. I pulled up to the front yard of the old house and immediately felt that old feeling of depression and anxiety. There was a for sale sign in the yard. The house was vacant. No cars in either driveway. I sat there and just stared, pondering what could have been in there with us. It looked dead, a lifeless relic of evil. As I sat there in my car, parked on the side of the street, directly across from the front door, I saw movement in my right peripheral vision. Those laced white-veiled curtains still hung in the window. I turned to look at the bay window, where I saw something. The curtain had been pulled aside, and I saw her face. It sounds crazy, but it's all true. And I hate that it's true, because it fills me with possibly, well, that demons might exist. A face, pale white, so pale, sickly, lifeless black eyes, almost like sewn on buttons with our large eyelids. Its expression was that of pure derision, a warning. The eerie face was expressing a scowl, an angry scowl. How could it have known I was outside in a car on a busy street where cars always pass by? This disturbed me even more, in that there exists the profound possibility that it can see inside my mind, something completely beyond the realm of human explanation. Oddly, it looked as if it had white hair, fashioned in exactly the way the wigs were worn in the 18th century. Think of those old paintings of George Washington. It leered at me, and I met its stare. We probably spent a full minute penetrating each other's gaze before I decided to pull away and leave. Squatter? Possible, but unlikely. I've never seen a human who looked like that. That was in there the entire time with us. I drove aimlessly, trying to compute what I'd just seen, but I just let it go. I never told my life. As a matter of fact, we lived in such hell that she made sure we never talked about it again. It was an absolute nightmare. Later on, we found out through a family friend that families would frequent the house in short bursts before moving out. My wife told me she saw her old neighbor from across the street at the store. They exchanged niceties in the parking lot before my wife brought up the house. The woman, whose name now eludes me, told her that nobody lives there anymore. She said, "Our place is absolutely haunted."